Good evening. How's everybody doing? Good. Glad to hear it. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Carl Aspeland. I'm the Associate Director of the Honors Program, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here for the 61st Honors Colloquium, this year titled Democracy in Peril. We are excited tonight to have Daniel Ziblatt, the author of How Democracies Die. He will be introduced in a little while by one of the colloquium organizers. I'd like to start tonight with some housekeeping details, however. Please note that in case of an emergency, the exits are in the back and to the sides of the stage. The bathrooms are in the foyer. And please, 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 no photos, no video recording tonight. And with that, I would ask you all now to take a moment to silence your cell phones. Please put the devices away so that we can turn our full attention to our guest speaker, who we are very privileged to have with us this evening. Now, if you do need to leave or go out into the hall this evening, please be aware that those doors in the back make an awful lot of noise, so maneuver carefully around them, and please refrain from speaking out in the hall because it does actually carry into the room. Now, before we go any further, I would like to welcome Nicoda Thompson to the stage. Nicoda is a student at URI and a Narragansett tribal member, and I would like Nicoda to join me for the land acknowledgement. Nicoda, please. The University of Rhode Island occupies the traditional stomping ground of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. We honor and we respect the enduring and continuing relationship between the Indigenous people and this land by teaching and learning more about their history and present-day communities, and by becoming stewards of the land that we too inhabit. Nicoda.
Askwikwasin, we are gathered today on the unceded homelands of the Narragansetts, my ancestors. For thousands of years, these lands have nourished us, medicated us, and informed our values and beliefs. A land acknowledgement recognizes the generations of Indigenous people who have loved and were loved by this land. These relationships continue, but colonization has diminished our traditional systems. Through activism, advocacy, and the political process, we continue to assert our democratic voice to ensure that we are not forgotten in the systems that have grown up around us. This land is us, and we are the land. Our voices will continue to speak power to these ancestral connections in true democratic spirit. Please take a moment to consider the voices of Indigenous people fighting for the community of culture, the continuity of culture and community. If my words inspire you to take action to support the Indigenous communities, then this land acknowledgement will have served its purpose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this colloquium represents and celebrates what the honors program does best, namely, delve into the major issues of our time at timely moments. And what could be more timely than a colloquium about democracy during this presidential election year? This colloquium also embodies the new direction that we are heading in honors education, namely, to prepare our URI students to navigate and enact change in this daunting world. And I would also like to note that the honors colloquium seeks to foster campus-wide and community-wide discussion. And in this spirit, we are absolutely thrilled to promote some partner events, such as with the Center for Humanities, whose Sustaining Democracy speaker series begins this week. We have the URI Theater Department, who are opening a play called Machinal on October 10th. And this is a play, although 100 years old, speaks to us today by being about the subjugation and oppression of women in modern capitalist society. Note, there will be a panel discussion with the director and one of our colloquium organizers after the matinee on the 13th. Now, the Art and Art History Department are going to be setting up an exhibit in Lippitt Hall of something about 70-plus artworks with an exhibition titled Democracy in Peril, the Politics of Personality. And I would encourage you to stop by Lippitt Hall to take a look. By the way, if you do see flyers about this, it does say open between 5 and 9. That's really just a courtesy of sorts. The building is actually open all the time. So do drop by and take a look at the art. This will be very exciting. It's going to be all over the 3rd and 4th floors. Finally, the Hera Gallery. If you came in at a certain moment here this evening, you saw me out there in the hall yelling with postcards. I do that. And these postcards, if you fill out what democracy means to you in 10 words or less and give them back to us, we will deliver them to the gallery, and the gallery is hoping to put them all over a wall or two in there with what democracy means to you. So please make sure you fill out those cards and give them back to us. You can take them home, fill them out, and bring them back if you need to think. You can take 2 and change your mind. That's what democracy is all about. Now, producing a series of this scope requires 1 or 2 years of planning and many, many campus partners. We would like to especially thank the Colloquium coordinators this year: Mark Hutchison, Ashley Rundlet, Brian Kruger, Beth Mendenhall, and Richard McIntyre from the College of Arts and Sciences. Let's hear it for them. I would also like to thank our sponsors for this year's program, who are listed on the program, and a special thanks to President Parlange and his office, and Provost Wolf and her office, both of whom are sustaining sponsors of our URI Honors Colloquium. They are both here tonight, and I would like you to give them a round of applause, please. We also have here tonight a representative of 401 TechBridge, a big contributor to this year's Colloquium. We would like to thank the College of Arts and Sciences for supporting this year's Colloquium organizers. And of course, we could not do this without our honors team, and thank you to them for all their hands-on support, and especially our honors coordinator, Anna Blake, who plays a central role in organizing this colloquium and pretty much in everything we do. So a big round for all of those above. Now, speaking of 401 TechBridge, they are behind something called the Rise Up I&E Challenge, the Resilient, Innovative, Sustainable Economies via University Partnerships. This initiative has invited URI students and researchers to address real-world issues within the university ecosystem. Participants have honed their problem-solving skills through workshops and seminars, gearing up to present their solutions to challenge hosts. The top contenders vie for recognition and cash prizes before a panel of judges. And this year's primary Rise Up I&E Challenge will actually correspond to our theme of democracy. So we are inviting students from all majors to generate creative ideas for addressing social, political, environmental, and economic problems through democratic innovation and entrepreneurship. If you're interested, and you should be, you can find more information at the Rise Up table in the hall after the presentation, and by filling out the Google form linked to this QR code. So, grab that, please. Now, I would be remiss if I did not ask you to please consider supporting the honors program with a donation. Beyond this wonderful colloquium that both community members and students attend, your donation could fund things like student projects, travel and social events, experiential learning experiences like the cost to take students out onto Narragansett Bay on a research vessel. We could fund our new project of commissioned art pieces that will portray the diversity of honor students through the years. So please grab said QR code again, and we would appreciate a donation. Thank you. Now, before I do leave the stage, however, I would invite you to come back next week for another exciting installment to listen to Andrew Idfedapo Thompson to speak to us on race and democratic backsliding in the US. And now, the moment we're waiting for, to introduce Daniel Ziblatt, Please welcome Ashley Rundlett, one of the organizers of this year's Colloquium and a professor of political science. Ashley.
Good evening. I know you are not here to listen to me, so I promise to be brief. So thank you all for coming here today. It's really nice to see such a good turnout again. My name is Ashley Rundlett. I'm one of the coordinators of the Colloquium and also an assistant professor of political science here at URI. As this is only the second event for this year's Colloquium, I'd like to take a moment to provide some context for those of you who are joining us the first time and explain how today's speaker, Daniel Ziblatt, fits into our broader theme of democracy in peril. The premise of this year's Colloquium is simple but urgent. Democracy is under threat, and it is worth defending. Our discussions are driven by the alarming global decline of democratic norms, a trend we've observed in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas, and beyond. Last week, Vox senior correspondent Zach Beecham argued that modern democracy, as we understand it, is a revolution. In the grand scope of human history, the notion that ordinary citizens should have a say in their governance is relatively new. In a short time, democracy has become embedded in our ethos to such an extent that even the most authoritarian regimes adopt the language of democracy to legitimize their rule. Zach went on to argue that what we've witnessed in the last 10 to 15 years could be described as a global counter-revolution, a systematic erosion of democratic norms and values. Where Zach Beecham argued that the current global retreat from democracy should be seen as a reaction to democracy's success in challenging social inequalities, today's speaker will focus more on the threats of democracy that have existed within our own democratic institutions, in many cases from the country's founding. Some of these threats undermined our democratic system before the counter-revolution, whereas others were just waiting to be exploited. Daniel Ziblatt will help us unpack these domestic challenges, drawing on extensive research to show how democratic erosion can happen from within. By examining the vulnerabilities embedded in our own institutions, he will challenge us to confront uncomfortable realities of our political system and the urgent need for vigilance and for reform. Daniel Ziblatt is Eaton Professor of Government at Harvard University, where he also directs their Center for European Studies. His contributions have been recognized with numerous awards, which I do not have the time to list all of them, but include his election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences just this last year. He is the author of 4 books and many articles, including an award-winning book that traces the history of conservative parties in Europe, where he argues that the stability of democracy often depends on the health of conservative parties. His 2018 book, How Democracies Die, co-authored with Steven Levitsky, spent several weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and was credited with significantly influencing President Biden's decision to run in the 2020 election. Indeed, actually, during the run-up to the election, the press reported that Biden would carry around How Democracies Die and pester his campaign aides with his favorite passages and make them read it out loud. So today's talk is going to focus on his latest co-authored book, which is also a New York Times bestseller, Tyranny of the Minority. So please join me in welcoming Professor Daniel Ziblatt.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Ashley, and thank you for hosting me today. I've really had a wonderful day meeting with students in the honors program, and it's really a great pleasure to be part of the honors colloquium. It's wonderful to have this series, and I'm really honored to be part of it. So thank you also to President Parlange and Provost Barbara Wolf and everybody I've met today for a really nice day. So as Ashley said, I'm going to talk a bit today from my most recent book, Tyranny of the Minority, which came out at the end of last year and has just been released in paperback this last week. So I've been thinking about it and talking about it, right in the midst of the campaign season. And one of the themes that comes out of that book, that I'll be coming back to a couple of times, is the sense that we are facing this urgent crisis, a short-term urgent crisis, but at the same time, we're living in a kind of long-run, the solutions require long-run reforms. And so sometimes the solutions move more slowly than the the problems. And so this creates a sense of frustration, I think, for a lot of us. But I'll come back to that. So the book, Tyranny, the Minority, was really written as a follow-up to this book, How Democracies Die, that I wrote in 2018. And that book was written really with the idea that we wanted to send our readers a set of warnings about what could happen to American democracy. My co-author and I had spent our careers studying other democracies. I mostly focus on Europe, my co-author on Latin America. And so in 2018, when we wrote this book, we were saying that democracies get into trouble. This is how it happens. This could happen in the US. And as we went around talking about that book, many people would ask us, what can we do about it? And so this book, in a sense, is an answer to that question. But in order to answer the question, what can we do about it, we felt we needed to do a deeper diagnosis of what had gone wrong in the United States. So that's the purpose of the book. So I think I'll begin, though, this evening with some statistics, some numbers. So the international organization Freedom House, which some of you may know, every year produces a global freedom index where it ranks every country in the world, gives it a democracy score ranging from 0 to 100. A decade ago, the US received a score of 94 out of 100, which put it on par with Great Britain, Germany, Canada. Today it has a score of 83, which is the same score that Romania has, and that's 2 points lower than Argentina. Now, this is sometimes shocking when I report this to people, but when you have government efforts to make it harder to vote, when you have violent threats against election officials, when you have an incumbent president try to block the peaceful transfer of power, then you reach a point that Freedom House scores you lower than Argentina. So falling from 94 to 83 between 2016 and 2024, the American political system has experienced what political scientists and what you'll hear about next week call democratic backsliding. I want to be really clear, this is not backsliding of the same scale that's come to Hungary or to India or to Turkey in recent years. It's a more modest backsliding, but it's significant. And so the question is, how did the US end up here? And that question is particularly striking, I think, because from a social scientific point of view, it's really pretty shocking. Because social scientists have discovered a couple of rock-solid findings that most political scientists agree with. First of all, rich democracies never die. No country with a per capita GDP above $17,000 has ever experienced a democratic breakdown. The US is 4 times that level of wealth. The second seemingly rock-solid finding is that old democracies never die. No democracy over the age of 50 has ever broken down. And so even if we date the birth of American democracy in 1965, which I think there's good reason to, because this is when voting rights were extended to all Americans, American democracy is over 50 years old. So given this, the sense of crisis, we have this slide here, democracy in peril, that we are experiencing in the United States raises a real puzzle. Unique among its peer nations, that is the old rich democracies of Western Europe and parts of Asia. So think of Germany, Switzerland, Spain, Netherlands, Scandinavia, Japan, South Korea. Unique among this cluster of countries, old rich democracies, the United States is experiencing democratic backsliding. So the question again is why? So what I want to do this evening is point to 2 factors, 2 culprits, and then talk about how we can think about addressing these. So the first culprit is the transformation of one of our 2 political parties, the Republican Party. And the second factor that I'll talk about is a set of political institutions that are distinctive to the United States that are making this global wave of democratic threats makes our country particularly susceptible to them. So I'm going to talk about each of these points, the transformation of the Republican Party and the nature of our political institutions. So the first challenge facing us is the transformation of the Republican Party, and in particular, what we contend in our book is the radicalization of the Republican Party and an authoritarian turn among certain elements within the Republican Party. Now, it's clear that this is important because democracy can't survive if one of its major parties is not committed to playing by democratic rules. I want to be clear now here what I mean by this, because especially in the campaign season, both sides accuse each other of being authoritarians now and being anti-democratic. And so one might think that this is a kind of partisan game and it's all in the eye of the beholder, and each side accuses the other side of not being democratic. So is there some way out of this? Isn't this all just a matter of perspective? And I would say no. Actually, one can come up with some pretty clear criteria. There are clear benchmarks, in other words, that we can use to evaluate democracies and political parties. So we draw on the work of a great Spanish political scientist, Juan Linz, who taught for many years, who was born in Weimar, Germany, grew up in Spain during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. In the 1970s, he wrote this little book called The Breakdown of Democratic Regimes, looking back over his life as well as the breakdown of democratic regimes in Latin America. And he proposed a set of criteria by which you can determine whether a political party or a politician is really committed to democratic norms and rules. And he essentially said that to be a loyal Democrat, to be a party and politician committed to democracy, you have to do three things. Number one, you must unambiguously accept the results of elections, win or lose. Number two, you must unambiguously reject the use of political violence. And then number three, you must break completely with anti-democratic extremists within your own ranks. So the first 2 points are pretty straightforward, I think, so I want to just develop that last point for a moment. Individual leaders can't kill a democracy on their own. They need accomplices among mainstream politicians. These are the kinds of figures that Linz called semi-loyalists. So, semi-loyalists are kind of hard to pick out in a crowd. They look and talk like ordinary democratic politicians. But the key difference between a politician committed to democracy and a politician that's semi-loyal is how they respond to authoritarian threats within their own camp. When ideological extremists emerge within the flank of a political party, right or left, what loyal Democrats do, what politicians committed to democracy do, is they publicly condemn anti-democratic behavior. They expel the anti-democratic extremists from their ranks, refusing to nominate them or support their candidacies. And crucially, maybe most important, they join forces with pro-democratic forces on the other side of the aisle. Now, semi-loyalists, on the other hand, although maybe looking like normal democratic politicians, do none of these things. Rather than repudiating anti-democratic behavior on their own flank, what semi-loyalists do is they downplay it and justify it by what we today call whataboutism. Rather than expelling the anti-democratic extremists from their own ranks, semi-loyalists tolerate and accommodate them. And again, crucially, what semi-loyalists do when when their allies emerge as anti-democratic forces, rather than joining forces with those across the aisle, they refuse to do that. They choose their own anti-democratic allies against the pro-democratic rivals, even when democracy is on the line. Now, the tragedy of this whole dynamic is that semi-loyalists usually aren't trying to kill democracy. They're just ordinary politicians trying to get ahead, ambitious politicians. Ambition's part of democracy. They're just trying to get ahead. They're trying to stave off a primary challenge, or they want to seek some higher office. But the problem is that semi-loyal behavior strengthens anti-democratic forces. Because when mainstream politicians tolerate or condone anti-democratic behavior within their own camp, what happens is this normalizes them. Major media outlets start to treat them like ordinary politicians. Donors who once shunned them start to return their calls. Leading consultants and advisors begin to work with them. And of course, voters begin to take them more seriously. So one of the key lessons that we make the case for in our book is that if you look at the democratic breakdown of regimes in the 1930s in Europe or in Latin America in the 1960s or 70s, democracy gets into trouble when mainstream parties begin to flirt with anti-democratic extremists, again, on either the right or the left. So the broader lesson for the United States from this history is that when we look at an event like January 6th, 2021, obviously a threat to democracy, just as important, or possibly even more important, is the pervasive semi-loyalty, or the emergence of semi-loyalty, the effort to kind of excuse it, to justify it, or to kind of provide an alternative narrative of events. Now, I think it's really, again, important to be clear here. that, I'm a political scientist. I mean, sometimes when we talk about these things, I'm always conscious of the thought that, maybe I'm being a partisan or, but I'm a political scientist. I'm trying to analyze these things as I see them. And actually, I'm not somebody who's naturally predisposed that conservatives are a threat to democracy inherently. And so, as Ashley mentioned, back in 2017, I wrote a book arguing that the emergence of democracy in 19th century Europe required constitutional conservative parties that played by democratic rules. So when I note that there's a kind of semi-loyal strand within the Republican Party, there are very specific things that I'm referring to. So certainly many Republican leaders were troubled by the Republican Party and Trump's anti-democratic behavior, but they've enabled it anyway. They protected President Trump by refusing to impeach him and convict him. They blocked the creation of an independent commission in January to look at the January 6th insurrection, and most continue to support him, of course, in 2024. Now, you might think, well, is this really realistic to expect anything different? And I guess the point I would make is it doesn't have to be this way. You compare the American experience to what happened in Brazil over the last several years, you'll see a different path. So, for several years, the United States and Brazil have actually seemed to follow very parallel lines. Like in the US in 2018, Brazil elected a right-wing president, Jair Bolsonaro, who openly admired Trump, who the New York Times called the Trump of the tropics. Like Trump, Bolsonaro lost his re-election bid and then tried to overturn the results, just like Trump in 2022. But his right-wing allies refused to go along with this. All of Brazil's leading conservative politicians publicly recognized Bolsonaro's defeat on election night. The president of the Congress, leading senators, governors, and in fact, Brazil had a kind of January 6th-like event on January 8th, 2023, in which protesters stormed a bunch of government buildings, including the Supreme Court. Conservative politicians in Brazil forcefully condemned the insurrection and backed a congressional investigation of it. No one downplayed it, no one condoned it, no one defended it. And so whereas this year we're in an election where the same candidate is once again on the campaign trail, Bolsonaro has been barred for office for 8 years, and few right-wing politicians have rallied to his defense. So again, whereas Trump is a contender for presidency, Bolsonaro is far from the political scene. So the point here is there was another path. Republican leaders simply didn't follow it. So this is again why we use these terms to describe this. So what has happened? What has happened? When I was walking around on campus today, I saw the social science buildings, the Chafee building, named after the governor of Rhode Island, and then his son, I guess, Lincoln Chafee. I mean, this is a long-standing tradition of a Republican Party that is perfectly loyal to the democratic process and a key participant in the democratic process. So how did this change? I mean, it's a remarkable transformation. Because, if we look around the world, it's very rare to see an established party that's been engaged in competitive politics for 150 years begin to turn its back on democracy. It doesn't happen often. So what we contend in our book is that what's driving this is a fear of losing. For democracy to work, political parties have to be able to tolerate losing. To tolerate losing, what this means is that parties have to believe that losing won't bring ruinous consequences. When parties or their constituents fear that losing power will pose an existential threat, they radicalize and turn on democracy. And just another dynamic here that we can talk about maybe in the question and answer period afterwards is, of course, many Democrats feel this way about Republicans as well. And so this, it's something to note. So this process, though, in the Republican Party, I think, has an analog, and this has happened before in American history. It's not, when we're writing the book, we are looking for other cases where this has happened in history in other countries or in the United States. And then when this happened in the United States was in the Democratic Party in the United States after the U.S. Civil War, during the Reconstruction era beginning in the 1870s. Reconstruction was America's first experiment with multiracial democracy. It brought widespread black enfranchisement. African Americans were a majority or near majority in most southern states. But enfranchisement of African Americans also terrified the southern elites of the Southern Democratic Party and their supporters. Because not only would black suffrage threaten the dominance of the Democratic Party in the U.S. South, it also threatened the entire racial order. So for many Southern whites, this felt like an existential fear. So the Democrats, beginning in the 1870s and through into the 20th century, responded by using violence and election fraud to seize power across the South. And they entrenched themselves in power by eviscerating African American civil rights and voting rights. Unwilling to lose or to accept multiracial democracy, the Southern Democrats established a system of authoritarian rule in the U.S. South that would endure for nearly a century. So, looking forward to today, we see something similar, certainly not identical, but something similar to the Republican Party. We contend that the roots of this phenomenon lie in the civil rights reforms of the 1960s, America's second experiment with multiracial democracy. The Civil Rights Revolution generated resentment among many white voters, particularly in the South. The Republican Party was the minority party at the time, but white racial resentment over civil rights created an incredible electoral opportunity for the Republican Party. So beginning with Goldwater in the 1960s, continuing with Nixon and Reagan, the Republicans consistently targeted racially conservative voters. And it worked. It was, in some sense, normal Democratic politics, because in little over a generation, many Southern whites flipped from being supporters of the Democratic Party to be overwhelmingly Republican. The Republicans won the white vote in every presidential election after 1964, and this helped them become the majority party, in which the Republicans won the presidential election, every election between 1968 and 1988, with the single exception of the Watergate election of 1976. But this successful strategy began to run into trouble, because at the same time that the Republican Party was doubling down on becoming a party of white conservative, racial conservatives, America was becoming less white and actually also less Christian. The percentage of Americans who identify as white and Christian fell from 80% in 1976 to 43% in 2016. So this posed two threats to the Republican Party. First of all, it was an electoral threat. It became increasingly difficult for a party constituted in this way to win in an increasingly diverse society. And in fact, that's why the Republicans have only won the popular vote, arguably for the presidency, once since 1988. When I recount this to my teenage daughters, they say Republicans have only won the popular vote for the presidency one time since Taylor Swift was born. They get the picture. In 1980, Ronald Reagan won 55% of the white vote. 55% of the white vote. It's translated into a landslide 44-state victory that we were talking about at dinner. 2012, Mitt Romney won 59% of the white vote, so higher percentage of the white vote, but still lost the election. American society had transformed. But the threat also went beyond just mere elections, because for many Republicans, racially conservative Republicans, it felt existential. Because America is undergoing a transition that all of us have lived through, that no other democracy has really undergone, in which a long dominant ethnic majority loses not only its numerical majority, but also its dominant status in society. And the perception that's the base of many MAGA voters, certainly not all, but the data is very clear, and you'll hear, I think, probably more about this again next week, is that the country they grew up in is somehow being taken away from them. And that's a powerful sense of existential fear, powerful enough to turn people away from democracy. So that's the first half of the story. But the thing that's quite distinctive, again, I wear my hat as a comparativist, looking at other countries around the world, and one of the things that I'm struck by is that these processes are very similar in other parts of the world. And in other parts of the world, the forces driving this often are immigration and increasingly diverse societies. And so what's distinctive about the U.S., why has the U.S. experienced democratic backsliding facing these kinds of transformations? And a point I would make is that this radicalization, this process of transformation, would pose much less of a threat if the United States were like other democracies in which majorities actually governed. Now, if you look at opinion polls across a whole range of subjects, it's really important to note something, which is that the core of the MAGA base, not all Republicans, but the core of the MAGA base that stuck with Trump even after January 6th, is roughly 30% of the American electorate. And again, as a comparativist, that number is striking because when you look at the radical right across Western Europe, the demagogic radical right, extremist right, some of them more authoritarian than others, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, what you see is that those parties get around 30% of the vote. It's a near constant across Western societies. Sometimes it's a little more, sometimes it's a little less. Around 20 to 30% of voters in most established democracies are supportive of radical right parties. And yet, to date, democracy has remained more robust in those places. When 45 days out from an election in any of the countries of Western Europe, nobody's afraid that democracy is at the precipice or in peril. So what makes the US different? It's not our voters. The voting bases look very similar. What's distinctive about the United States are our political institutions. And the problem, we contend, lies in something that many of us, including myself, venerate, which is the American Constitution. Now, need to say this at the outset. The American Constitution is a remarkable document, deserves to be defended. It's the basis of centuries of wealth and prosperity, and in fact, our democracy has improved with our Constitution. But there remain certain features of our Constitution which protect and amplify political minorities. And when that political minority, that 30%, is authoritarian, this can be quite dangerous. Now, again, the US Constitution, when it was written, was a revolutionary document, but it was crafted in a pre-democratic era. It was designed in part to protect against the tyranny of the majority, but it has, in some sense, generated the opposite problem. Because more so than any other democracy on earth, electoral majorities often cannot win power in the United States. And even when they win power, they often can't govern. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, that's sort of by design. That's the whole point of the Constitution. What are sometimes called counter-majoritarian institutions are essential to democracy. They were baked into the Constitution. And that's true to some degree. Some of these counter-majoritarian institutions that limit the power of majorities are there by design and serve an important purpose. Because democracy requires the protection of minority rights. Not everything should be up for grab in an election. The US Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson famously put it back in the 1940s. He said, some domains must be placed beyond the reach of majorities. And that's certainly right. But I think something that's not sufficiently recognized is not every counter-majoritarian institution strengthens democracy. We can kind of distinguish between what we might think of as good counter-majoritarian institutions and bad counter-majoritarian institutions. The bad ones that grant unfair advantage to competitors and undermine political competition. So let me use an analogy that we use in our book. We say in a professional soccer match, rules that ensure fair competition or protect players by banning dangerous and unfair play are essential. But in that same soccer match, rules that allow one team to begin with a goal advantage, or which would even award victory to a team that scores fewer points, would be patently unfair. So when it comes to our Constitution, how do we distinguish between these different kinds of institutions? Well, we try to do this in our book. And the way I'll describe it is first to say where these kinds of restraints on majorities or counter-majoritarian institutions should operate. So two domains in particular must be protected from majorities. The first is basic civil liberties. Civil liberties like the right to vote, free speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. These things are essential. They need to be protected from the whims of a temporary majority who maybe wants to stamp out the rights of a minority. So that's certainly true, civil rights. Second area where majorities ought not govern where counter-majoritarianism is critical, is the democratic process itself. Elected governments shouldn't be able to use their temporary majorities. A party can't be elected with a majority, come into power, and entrench itself in power by, for example, changing the rules of the game to weaken the opposition or to create unfair competition so the opposition can never win again. This is the classic problem of majority tyranny. This is how Viktor Orban has monopolized power in Hungary. This is how Hugo Chavez monopolized power in Venezuela. And so we need mechanisms in our political system to protect the democratic system from majorities. This is why we have things like the Bill of Rights and an independent judiciary. So basic civil liberties and fair competition are essential. But again, here's the hitch. Not all constraints on majorities are essential to democracy. And just as certain domains must be placed beyond the reach of majorities, other domains in our political system must be within the reach of majorities. So I'll mention two. One is elections. I'll put it simply. Those with more votes should prevail over those with fewer votes in determining who holds political office. No theory of liberal democracy can justify any other outcome. In other words, office holding should reflect how voters vote. Number two, a second domain that should be within the reach of majorities is legislatures. Those who win elections should actually be able to govern. Partisan minorities shouldn't be able to permanently veto regular legislation backed by parliamentary or legislative majorities, provided the legislation doesn't violate basic minority rights. So institutions that prevent majorities from winning power or from governing in legislatures aren't essential to democracy. They're arguably antithetical to democracy. Now, when we look at the US, and this comes back to the questions, why is the US in this distinctive situation? If we look at the US compared to other democracies, it has an unusual number of these latter kinds of constraints on majorities. The Electoral College famously allows the loser of the popular vote to win the presidency. A severely malapportioned Senate means that you get equal representation to all states regardless of population. That's an easier line to deliver in California than in Rhode Island, I understand. But the Senate filibuster allows a partisan minority to permanently block legislation backed by the majority. And a powerful Supreme Court with extensive review power and lifetime appointments means that justices appointed in one generation can thwart majorities for generations to come. Now, again, we tend to think of these things as sort of there by design, as part of a far-sighted, well-calibrated plan to create the perfect kind of republic by our wonderful founding fathers, and in many cases they were geniuses, I think. But not all of our institutions reflect well-thought-out plans. They were in many instances the result of compromise and improvisation of the founders themselves in a very difficult founding moment. And these concessions and compromises built biases into our political system, in particular overrepresenting small, initially, and then later, sparsely populated territories. So the Electoral College, the Senate, and because the Senate approves the president's nominees for the Supreme Court, the national judiciary, the Supreme Court as well. Now, it's certainly true that this rural bias has long been with us. So you may say, well, why is this a problem now? And the answer is that this rural bias in our institutions never seriously biased one political party over another, gave an advantage to one political party over another, because for most of our history, both political parties had urban and rural wings. It's really only in the 21st century that US parties have split so cleanly on urban-rural lines, so in which the Democrats are primarily the party of metropolitan areas, while the Republicans are overwhelmingly based in sparsely populated territories. This bias towards rural areas now gives the Republican Party a bias in the electoral, an advantage, systematic advantage in the Electoral College, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. And this is the key point, which allows them to win national power without winning national majorities. Now, this bias has three very specific consequences. The first, it gives rise to an exaggerated misperception, I would say, of partisan stalemate or partisan parity. Our politics looks like a dead heat, and it is to some degree, but I think it's not quite exactly right. Because part of this parity, where the two parties seem to be in a dead heat, part of it at least is institutionally engineered. So consider the presidency. Democrats have won the popular vote for the presidency 7 out of the 8 last presidential elections, yet Republicans have held the presidency nearly half the time. Consider the Senate. US senators are elected to staggered 6-year terms, with a third of the chamber being re-elected every 2 years. So this means it takes a kind of 6-year cycle to fully renovate the Senate. The Democrats have won the popular vote in every 6-year cycle since 2000, but Republicans have controlled the Senate for half the time. And then finally, the Supreme Court. 3 of our current Supreme Court justices were nominated by a president who lost the popular vote and were confirmed by senators who represented less than half the population. Now, it's very difficult to justify this kind of thing with any kind of theories of liberal democracy. So that's one point. Second consequence is that this is beginning to feel for many Americans like a form of minority rule. Policy preferences, what people want, are more and more out of sync with what our government delivers. Now, there's lots of reasons for this, but there's overwhelming majorities of Americans who want more robust gun control, more robust policy efforts to deal with poverty, raise the minimum wage, abortion rights of the sort guaranteed by Roe versus Wade. And again, this disjuncture between what voters want and what we get in our policy, there's many reasons. Big money plays a role, well-organized interest groups, and so on. But certainly our institutions, which don't always represent majorities, contribute to this. So that's the second consequence, this feeling of minority rule. There's a third consequence that I think maybe is least appreciated, which is that these institutions are having a feedback effect, we contend, on the Republican Party itself. And that in a way, these institutions are actually making the problem of Republican extremism worse. Because these institutions shield the Republican Party from national competitive pressures. Democratic competition is supposed to kind of work like a market. When firms don't sell products, they lose money. When firms lose money, they come under pressure to fire the managers, come up with a new strategy, etc. Now, in democracies, political parties are supposed to win elections. When parties lose elections, they're supposed to adapt, maybe come up with new candidates, new strategies, broaden their appeal. So when the Democratic Party lost 3 consecutive elections in the 1980s, they moved to the center and picked Bill Clinton in 1992, a new Democrat. Same thing happened in Britain, British Tory Party, or British Labour Party, as well as the British Tory Party. That process of adaptation isn't happening in the Republican Party today. Republicans have repeatedly underperformed in presidential year elections, midterm year elections, but so far there's been very little effort. It's a kind of puzzle that lots of people puzzle over. Why has the party not moderated? And this is in part because the institutions give the Republican Party an electoral crutch. So in our book, we call this constitutional protectionism. If you think of competition as being a free market, protectionism hampers competition. These institutions hamper competition. Republicans don't actually have to win national majorities. So extremism doesn't cost the party in the same way that it would in a truly competitive environment. If the Republicans actually had to win national majorities to win the presidency, there would be much greater pressure to rein in the extremism in the party today. This, in addition, is contributing to the crisis. So the last point I want to make today is that this minority rule, or the sense that majorities aren't ruling and the governing in the way they ought to, is a distinctly, unusually American problem. And no other established democracy can partisan minorities so systematically and regularly block majorities. So why is this the case? Well, it turns out excessive counter-majoritarianism that I've just been describing actually used to be quite widespread across the world. In the 19th century Europe, states had all sorts of undemocratic institutions: monarchical vetoes, indirect elections, unelected legislative chambers, or really badly malapportioned legislative chambers, filibuster-like mechanisms. But other democracies over the course of the 19th and especially the 20th century gradually dropped and shed these pre-democratic institutions. So Britain weakened its House of Lords, stripping it of its veto power in the early 20th century. Denmark, Sweden, New Zealand, Portugal got rid of their undemocratic upper chambers. Germany, Austria, Belgium democratized their upper chambers, their Senate-like bodies, by making them more proportional, not perfectly proportional, but more proportional to population, so that bigger states, Bavaria, gets more representation than a small state, let's say like Saarland in Germany. Germany, Switzerland, France imposed term limits on Supreme Court justices, while the United Kingdom, Canada, and Sweden and other democracies established retirement ages for justices. And every other presidential democracy on earth got rid of its electoral college. Argentina was the last in 1994. So other democracies have become more democratic over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries that got rid of these institutions that allowed minorities to systematically thwart majorities. The US has done some of this, but not to the same degree. So today, the United States is the only presidential democracy with an electoral college. We have the most malapportioned Senate in the world, except for Argentina and Brazil. No other democracy allows congressional minority to regularly block majorities in the legislature. And the US is the only established democracy with truly lifetime appointment for Supreme Court justices or national justices. All other democracies have either retirement ages or term limits. So the US is an outlier in each of these scores. And when you add them up, it's uniquely counter-majoritarian And I think this in part explains why the US seems to be uniquely threatened by this wave of authoritarianism. Okay, so I can just tell, I can't see you all because the lights are in my eyes, but I can tell you're all depressed. So what do we do about it? That's what I said when we wrote the book. I haven't given you any of that yet. I think it's important to identify these problems and then to think about how to address them both in a short-term sense and in a long-term sense. So in our book, we actually propose 15 proposals of suggestions for democratic reform. I won't go through the whole list, but they are necessary for the long-run revitalization and stability of our democracy. Some highlights include entrenching voting rights. The United States, there's no actual right to vote in the US Constitution, ensuring equal access to the ballot, replace the Electoral College with direct presidential elections, democratize the Senate filibuster by weakening it, diluting it. I hear Kamala Harris said something about that today, in fact. Expanding the House of Representatives, which doesn't require constitutional amendment. Establishing term limits for Supreme Court justices. It's not an arbitrary wish list. Some of these things hurt Democrats, some of these things hurt Republicans. The common thread is we need to make it easier for majorities to win power and to govern. So many Americans, though, I think, feel deep in our bones that the approaching election is going to put our democracy at risk. And so our point is that unless we address these underlying ailments, even if we get through to November 2024, we'll be back in this situation 4 years, unless we begin to address these underlying ailments. And so that's why I think it's so critical to take up an agenda of institutional reform. But that doesn't help us before November, which is only 45 days away. So in the short run, and this is a more general point, how to deal with democratic threats in the short run. I think the lessons of other countries are pretty clear that it's critical to build big, broad coalitions from left to right among political leaders, civil society organizations, religious organizations, business leaders, who all share a commitment to democracy. Back in the late 1990s, a role model of Trump's, Viktor Orban in Hungary, was elected prime minister. He was voted out after one term. 8 years later, he ran again, and he won again, vowing to himself that he would never lose another election. It was in 2010, and he hasn't. And part of the reason, the way he got back into office and has been able to stay in office is a fractured opposition, a democratic opposition that feared him, but engaged in all sorts of infighting that allowed him back in the door. And so my concern is that we don't do the same thing today. And from my perspective, the most important thing is democracy in this current moment. So this means, if you think that this is a threat, if you agree with me, no third-party voting, no non-voting, no failing to vote to kind of express dissatisfaction. And this is especially true, I would say, for young voters who are in some sense a kind of secret weapon of democratic oppositions. But another important point of resistance is within civil society itself. So I think business interests in particular are really critical here. Capitalism relies on democracy. The risk of democratic instability for democracy is real. And so I think business needs to understand that it's, maybe taxes go up, but it's in its long-term enlightened self-interest to support democracy. So I think we need to do everything, in fact, to facilitate a broad coalition. And if we don't, we risk losing our democracy. And I think there's simply too much at stake. Thank you.
All right, we are now going to open it up for questions. We're going to have Brian and Beth walk around with microphones. They'll hold the mic. We request this time that when you ask a question that you please stand up if that's possible. And please keep your questions to questions and not comments. Thank you very much.
I'm going to hold the mic. Right, sorry. Hi, I just wanted to ask, earlier on in your speech, you referenced that democracies that are older don't usually die, but you also compared America to other nations like Japan and China, which have existed for thousands of years instead of like a couple hundred. So do you think there's a reason America is going through these issues so much sooner in its existence than other nations have?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't consider China a democracy. So, I mean, the age of the nation is not what matters. The question is, how long has a country been a democracy for? And so most democracies were really built after 1945. And so, there's a few democracies that have endured throughout this period. One particularly interesting country, I think, is Norway, which is actually a country that has the world's second oldest constitution from 1814. And began as a very monarchical, undemocratic system, but over time has amended its constitution 300 times, and today, according to Freedom House, is one of the most, gets a perfect score on. And so it's possible for a country to be around for a long time and last for a long time and become more democratic. The U.S., I think in some senses, I think the U.S. is more democratic today than it was in 1960. The U.S. in 2016 was more democratic than it was at any point in its history. So, this kind of blip that we've experienced over the last 7 or 8 years is pretty striking. So again, it's not the age of a country; it's rather the age of a democracy. And I guess I would also add to that, we have we have the oldest constitution in the world, but having a constitution of a republic, which meant we didn't have a monarchy, doesn't mean we were a democracy at our founding. I mean, the way that political scientists conventionally define democracies today, I would say, again, sort of post-1965. But I don't think in some sense we're underperforming. I mean, it's an exception. We're an anomaly. If you look at this relationship between age, wealth, and democracy, usually that should be enough. If you believe the social science over the last 100 years, that should be enough that we don't experience what we're having. So it's exactly that puzzle, really, that motivated this book. And our answer to the question is exactly this. We have these unusual institutions that are making us more vulnerable to this authoritarian way.
Hi. Let's say an authoritarian politician is elected to...
It's hard to hear you.
Oh, sorry. What's the most immediate threat of an authoritarian politician or an authoritarian party being elected in recent? Because there's more fears of... It's kind of hard to imagine that you would completely revamp the country in some sort of authoritarian way, because Hungary, it still took a number of years for it to turn from a relatively a democracy into an authoritarian regime. What's the most immediate threat of changing in the next, in the upcoming election, for example?
Good, thank you. So, what's the most immediate threat? Yeah, I think there's all sorts of sources of resilience in the American political system that Hungary or Russia. I mean, I think these are not the right analogies. Hungary is a very centralized, small country where once Viktor Orban was able to gain a supermajority of votes in one election, he was able to revamp the constitution without much resistance. Before people even really knew what was happening. I've spoken to Hungarian opposition leaders, and in 2010, there was all these bills coming through the parliament, and in the middle of a bill on gas prices, there would be a line in there about how the court system's being reconfigured, and people, they'd be given the bill the night before the election, and people didn't even really know what was happening. I think it's much in the American political system because of our federal system, because of the decentralization of power that comes with that, because of the robustness of our civil society and our media institutions, because of large pockets of wealth, which are often in blue states. I think the idea that authoritarianism is going to arrive overnight is overstated. But that doesn't mean that there are not threats. I mean, I think the thing that I guess am much more concerned about are efforts to. So it's perfectly democratic. Somebody can be elected perfectly democratically. The question is, what do they do when they're in office? And just because you've been elected doesn't mean that everything you do freely and fairly doesn't mean that everything you do is democratic. If you tilt the playing field, try to make it harder for the opposition to win by gerrymandering or trying to corrupt the electoral process, that's authoritarian. If you try to make it harder for people to vote, especially those of the other side, that's authoritarian. If you attack the civil liberties of citizens, that's authoritarian. So the famous Project 2025 contains a lot of this stuff. So I think, if you want to know what to be afraid of, that's what to be afraid of. But I agree with you that there will be, if that were to come to pass, there'll be massive resistance against this. But, it's a mistake to those think, well, that means we don't have to worry, because, who is it that's going to do the resistance? I mean, it's all of you, right? I mean, anybody who thinks that democratic rights are valuable, you have to be the resistance to this. And resistance to this means filing lawsuits, means voting, etc. So, I guess the thing I'm concerned about is the degree of social unrest that could accompany this, because people will push back against this. I mean, if these idea that you will go, that Homeland Security will go into people's homes, and people who aren't citizens illegally, and more significantly, people who are here illegally, they'll be taken out of their homes, families will be broken apart, and we know how this stuff operates. There's lots of cases of mistaken identity. There's neighbors telling police, so I think this person's here illegally. There's personal petty grievances. I mean, there's all sorts of mistakes that get made in a situation like this. And this kind of thing will generate outrage, or would generate outrage. I should put it in the conditional. Would generate outrage, and would generate protest. And so how does a Trump administration respond to that? I'm not quite sure, but I'm concerned about the instability that results. And so, in some sense, that's bad for capitalism. It's bad for raising your family in an environment like that, and it's bad for everybody, I would say.
What is the role of disinformation in the growth of extremism and thus democratic decline?
Thank you. I didn't talk at all about that. I mean, it's really a critical issue. I have to say, I think that over time I've become more and more convinced that it's more important. It's pretty clear that, lots of empirical work on this showing that there's these silos and echo chambers, and people hear only the views they agree with. It radicalizes people both on the right and the left. So when you just watch MSNBC day after day after day, it's going to push you to the left. I mean, the evidence is pretty clear about this. You just watch Fox News. You were clapping, I thought, but you were killing mosquitoes. Sorry about that. Then it pushes you to the right. So, but that's not social media. I mean, but this is only exacerbated by social media because of the nature of the algorithms and so on. So that's one important point. Another important point, though, is that this is not all unintentional. I mean, there's active efforts to try to, polarization pays. Is something that I've heard people say. Companies make money off of it. And so, this is a big problem, and I don't know, I'm not the one to know how to deal with it. I hope you have somebody who could talk about that in your series, because it certainly requires regulation, but how you balance free speech against this is very tricky. I mean, we've seen this with Twitter and X. So I think it contributes to it. But I guess my sort of broad stance on this is that technology often is not the root cause of polarization, but rather exacerbate underlying social realities. I mean, there has to be some kind of underlying tendency towards polarization. There's deep sociological changes taking place, and the technology exacerbates this and makes this much worse. And so, figuring out how to deal with this, it's a little bit like early days of radio and television.
What do you see to be the political viability of such a step like eliminating the Electoral College or the Senate filibuster?
Well, I think the Senate filibuster is much more viable it's much easier to imagine that, at least weakening. Now, I know there's, because it's a Senate rule, and for most of our history it was used very rarely, and it only became, despite what Joe Manchin says or Kristen Sinema says, who think that's part of the Constitution of the Founding Fathers. If you read the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton is very clear. He says, supermajority rules are distorting. So rules like the filibuster. And he was talking about the Articles of Confederation, but he was very critical of these, and he thought that, and both Madison and Hamilton say, the essence of the Republican principle is majority rule. And actually, if you look at the description of the role of the vice president in the Constitution as the tie-breaking vote, it says the vice president is supposed to serve in the Senate as the president of the Senate as a tie-breaking vote. So the idea of a tie-breaking vote presumes that there's a 50-50 vote. So in the Constitution, it's assumed that there would be 50-50 votes. And the Senate rule developed that you could have supermajority rules. It expanded in its usage. And it's now reached this point where, it's every piece of legislation, even those that are not going to take away anybody's rights. There's some vote on the size of an agricultural tariff. It has to pass the Senate a supermajority rule. So, back in 2022, there was this voting rights bill that came up in front of the Senate. Majority of senators supported it. This is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, but it couldn't pass the filibuster rule in the Senate. You actually had 50, you had 48, you have to have 50 senators vote for this. You had the Manchin and Sinema were the two who were not in favor of eliminating the filibuster. Everybody else said they went along with it. I don't know to what degree they were actually sort of just saying they would go along with it, knowing that Sinema and Manchin would reject it. But people are on the record saying they want to do it. And again, Kamala Harris actually just said today in an interview that if a Roe versus Wade kind of restoration bill would come in front of the Senate, she would be in favor of eliminating the filibuster. So I guess the point is, now I should say the other side of the debate is, well, God, isn't this kind of scary? What happens if somebody passes bills? Let's say there's a bill that comes in front of the Senate to outlaw abortion. Democrats are going to want to have a filibuster. And so it is a risky proposition, and it's not. And actually, I think Democrats generally benefit from the filibuster because they tend to not have the majority. And so this gives them a tool to block Republican majorities in the Senate. But I guess the way I think about this is that no other democracy has this, and everybody else manages to get through things. And so we have to trust our citizens. If somebody's going to propose an outrageous bill, let the process unfold. I think they'll be punished at the ballot box. And so we'll see. I think this will be on the agenda when it comes to voting rights, and the way this happens is there's not an actual vote on we're voting to get rid of the filibuster. What happens is a bill comes in front of the Senate, and it's depending on the rules that are in front of the Senate on that particular bill, then the bill can get through with normal rules rather than this kind of supermajority requirement. And that's a process of weakening the filibuster. So I think there's some prospect. Electoral college, much more difficult because it requires constitutional amendment. The last time this was attempted was in 1970, passed the House, had a majority support in the Senate. Republicans and Democrats were in favor of eliminating it. Richard Nixon was in favor of eliminating it. The American Bar Association was in favor of eliminating it. The AFL-CIO was in favor of eliminating it. The American Chamber of Commerce was in favor of eliminating it, but several senators blocked it. So it's sort of dead since then. There's a couple other avenues, though, of doing this without constitutional reform, including things such, if you remember the way that some of the students who are here heard this earlier today, the way that so Rhode Island has 4 electors. It's based on the fact that there's 2 senators from Rhode Island and 2 House members. I think this is right. If you increase the size of the House of Representatives, which is something that happened every decade until the 1920s, more populous states like Texas would suddenly have bigger weight in the Electoral College, as would California, as would New York. And this doesn't require constitutional reform, and it would make the Electoral College more proportional. So this is maybe another way to reform things. It's a little more complicated, not quite as bold of a headline, but it would make our system more fair.
We are at our last question.
In a few European countries, center and left parties adopted some conservative positions, like when it comes to immigration. Denmark is an example. Netherlands could be moving in that direction. Could that be replicated in the US? Like you mentioned, the 30% Christian white base of Trump, for example. Could the Democratic base coalition adopt some policy positions and soften that base, move maybe some of them to the Democratic coalition?
Yeah, that's the brilliant thing about democracy is that it's a self-correcting system. That's what makes democracies superior to authoritarian systems. There's a kind of feedback loop, and the feedback loop is you lose, and you have to come up with a new strategy to win. You abandon failed strategies and you come up with new strategies. Try to find new voters. And so that's how a democracy can rescue itself. And so certainly parties should be doing this kind of thing all the time. The Democratic party's electoral base is incredibly heterogeneous. And, so it's done a pretty good job of this, but it obviously, could do better and could win elections. And so finding those new kinds of voters certainly is something I know that Democratic strategists are always doing all the time. So when you're a Democratic campaign consultant, you're actually doing the work of democracy because you're trying to make the system work. My view, I guess, is that, this may be an odd view to say it, but I think in a way, if the Republican Party would become a multi-ethnic, multiracial party, then it wouldn't be so fearful of these kinds of changes. So in a sense, the kind of sign of democratic success, in my worldview, is when you have two political parties that reflect all the different strands of America's incredibly diverse society, and they begin to compete about not democracy. We wouldn't have to have a session on democracy in peril. You could have a semester-long colloquium on climate change, on tax policy, on gun control, on the things that really affect people's lives. And if parties didn't have to fight over democracy, and I think the way you get there is by having two very diverse parties that reflect, you could have a multi-ethnic conservative party that wants more restrictive immigration, multi-ethnic center-left party that's a little bit more open to it. So in any case, I think that what you lay out is one pathway, but I think there's multiple pathways. The point is to have a competitive system, because democracy is the only system in the world in which we can get rid of our leaders who we don't like peacefully. And so we have to make this system work. Thank you.
Thank you again, Professor Daniel Ziblatt, for coming, and thank you, everyone. We hope to see you here next week for Professor Andrew Thompson, and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, good. Good.